Hi, I'm Sam Edis.
And I'm Amy Nelson. Welcome to What's Her Story with Sam and Amy.
This is a show about the world's most remarkable women, their professional and personal journeys.
Together, we'll hear from gold medalists, best-selling authors, and leaders of the world's most iconic brands.
Listen every Thursday or join the conversation anytime on Instagram at What's Her Story Podcast.
Gloria Feldt was the CEO and president of Planned Parenthood from 1996 to 2005, the world's largest reproductive health and advocacy organization. She was named by Vanity Fair one of America's top 200 women leaders, legends, and trailblazers, and a Glamour Woman of the Year.
So you went from being a teen mom to running Planned Parenthood years later. It's quite an unusual trajectory. Can you talk a bit about your teen years?
Well, I think it was very symmetrical that I would go from knowing what it's like to be a very, that I would go from knowing what it's like to be a very young mother, to understanding the struggles that women have, to wanting to help all women be able to plan and space their childbearing. And so it really was a fairly seamless thing, but I really got my grounding in volunteer work that I did for the civil rights movement after I'd had my 3 children and I was 20 years old, and I sort of woke up, and partly it was because the birth control pill came out right about then.
Well, okay, before you go into that, Gloria, I really do want to hear a little bit more about your teen years and what it was like. Share with us, what was it like to become a teen mom? Was it intentional? Was it a surprise? How did people in your family react?
It didn't take me long to realize I had not made the wisest choice. But here's the thing. I had grown up in small Texas towns. The little town where I went to high school, called Stamford, is very like, if you've ever seen the movie or read the book, The Last Picture Show by Larry McMurtry. It's one of those dying West Texas towns. And it was a great place to be a teenager because it was like everybody knew everybody, and it was one great community. It felt that way. But girls not given aspirations for careers or even they're going to college. The girls who were rewarded were those who were engaged and married early, like in high school or right out of high school, and being a support system for everybody else. It was not. It was not unrelated that my family was the only Jewish family in town, in the Bible Belt, where the first question everybody asks you is, "Where do you go to church?" And and it was, even to this day, my high school colleagues, who I still love and am in touch with, they never let me forget that I am different. They never let me forget that. And being different, because what does a teenager want? A teenager fit in. A teenager wants to be the class favorite, which I got to be. A teenage girl in football, crazy Texas, wants to be a cheerleader, which I got to be. So, I got to be the girl, and that was the flip side of that, was that I bought the whole culture. No sex education other than a book that my father gave me when I was 13, bless his heart, which made me very popular at summer camp. But, and it got just completely worn out by all my friends at summer camp. And I hadn't really, I would say, the kinds of things that we talk a lot about now, teaching our children, just didn't happen then. You were kind of allowed to just grow up. And that's what I did. And I made not the wisest choices, and yet at the same time, life turned out pretty well. So I think think that having those children at that stage of my life forced me to grow up really quickly, forced me to of responsibility that the things that I needed to know later on when I became a CEO.
What
I
kind of a
said,
mom were you?
what?
What kind of a mom were you then in Texas?
Well, what kind of a mom was I? You'd have to ask my children that. They would, as one of my children said, you did. And I think that there's a lot of truth in that. It was, I was a very engaged mom, and my children were the center of my life, partly because I had ideas about how I wanted them to grow up. And of course, your children never do what you think you do. But
Hmm.
I did have ideas about that I tried to inculcate, and to a greater or lesser extent. But there again, my children grew up in Odessa, Texas, home of Friday Night Lights.
Hmm.
Sorry, the Friday Night Lights, and they graduated from Permian High School. So I'm telling you, that was the story of our life right there, a
Hmm.
documentary of our life. And and so the culture had changed. The culture changes for each generation. And you may think you know how you want to raise your children, but something will be different for them that you will not understand.
At that point,
Happened for me.
What?
you were a teen mom raising kids with this husband who was also a teenager, right? What
He was
led to the end of your marriage, and what was your ambition like at that point? Did you always just think you were going to be a wife and that was it?
to be the perfect Susie Homemaker wife. And then I found out it wasn't quite as much fun as I thought it was going to be. College when my youngest was 4 months old. And
Wow.
it made a big difference. And as I started learning about the world and being more a part of the world outside of my family, started changing, but things were also changing in society. US, he was 19 when we were married. And I would say that as parents who were that young, we did pretty well. We were fortunate. We always had a roof over our head, and we never had a lot of money, but we weren't cute, and we had parents who were reasonably supportive. I always say, my father had a clothing factory, so I always had fabric, and I made clothes for everybody. And my ex-husband's family had a farm, so we always had great food, and so we were good. We were good. But as with most teenage marriages, after 18 years, by that time, we had just become completely different people from each other. And we still respect each other, we're still in touch, but it was time to move on for both of us.
But when you went back to college when your youngest child was 4 months old, like that wasn't probably expected, right? Maybe even by yourself. And it's like, how did your family react to that? How did your husband react to that? Your parents, like, what did they think of you?
My family was delighted because they had always assumed I would go to college and
Hmm.
that I would have, that I would at least have an education, whether I did a professional thing or not. They valued education, and I remember my father gave me $50 for my first semester's tuition. And my husband's parents were not so appreciative of it. They thought it was not a good idea for me to leave the children the week that I took my classes. I was very careful to take my classes all Tuesdays and Thursdays, and there was a lovely young woman who was a neighbor who would come to our house and knew the children and took care of them. So I knew they were well taken care of. But my husband's family was not so. Although they weren't terribly vocal about it, I would say that my husband was reasonably supportive. he wasn't going to change his behavior. As long as I was still doing the cooking and cleaning and taking care of the kids, he was fine with it.
As long as you weren't a disruptor.
Yes, there you go. There you go. There you go. Yes, right. So it took me 12 years to finish because courses more slowly, because there was only a community college in Odessa, Texas at the time. And that was good, as it turns out, because it to get involved in community service work. Another thing about was that they were always engaged in the community. So from my youngest year, I saw my grandmother volunteering, my mother and father were, they volunteered for things. And so following that pattern, I got involved with the civil rights movement. And that's where I learned that people can change things. People working together can change things, even if they start with very little power.
At what point did you decide to join Planned Parenthood?
Right. As I was doing the work in the civil rights movement, I noticed that women were doing the frontline work and the men were getting most of the leadership positions on credit. So, the light bulbs start going off. And I started getting interested in helping women in general. And I was volunteering for Head Start, and then I was offered a Head Start. I taught Head Start for 5 years, and during that time, one of my teaching colleagues, and believe it or not, the priest of her church, were on the local Planned Parenthood board. It was a brand new little affiliate in the early 1970s, and she to do some volunteer work for Planned Parenthood. It was actually my introduction to the organization. So it wasn't oh my goodness, I'm going to go get involved with Planned Parenthood. It was my colleague, would you serve on this committee? And I said yes. And I went to my first, I attended a board meeting. So I went to my first board meeting, and they were arguing about whether to serve teens on their own consent. Again, teen mom, I'm thinking, yeah, you should. And we had a huge screaming argument about it. Finally voted that after a girl had had one, quote, illegitimate child, then she could get birth control on her own consent.
Wow.
And the county judge was on the board, this tall, lanky guy. And he leans back in his chair and puts his boot up on the table, and he says, well, now I ain't shutting the barn door after the cows done got out. And I'm like, what is this organization? People. So I really didn't have anything to do with it for a while. I mean, I wasn't that turned off, but I just didn't get that. So a few years later, the University of Texas opens a branch in Odessa. I enrolled so I can finish my degree, planning to be a high school social studies teacher. And the last course that I took was an ecology course. And I decided I would do my paper on this little Planned Parenthood affiliate. I called the executive director and asked her if I could interview her. And I interviewed her, a nurse practitioner, a couple of 2 weeks later, she called me and she said, I'm leaving. I think you should submit a resume. And I thought, well, I've never had a formal job interview before. I've never had a resume. I'm eminently unqualified. I am in no danger of being hired, but it'll be great experience to go and have this interview. And so I went for an interview, and then I went for a second interview, and lo and behold, they offered me the job. And I have no idea to this day why I was foolish enough to say I had no idea what I was doing. But it sounded kind of interesting. So I said yes. And there we are. 30 years later, I retired as the national. Just never know where life will take you if you just say yes.
Well, Amy and I always say that we're big yes people. We love to say yes to things, and there's so much rhetoric for women on how you should say no and say no to all these opportunities, and doors close when you say no and they open when you say yes. And so when you say something, you just said something that struck me. You said, I don't know why I was foolish enough to take it, but I really don't think that speaks to who you are. You are such a positive person, and through all of the battles you face throughout your life, you maintain a smile and a positivity about people working together. Where does that come from?
It's so fun. I am often asked, particularly by younger women, why I look like I'm so optimistic in spite of all of the things that they're encountering every day. And back, I can say, well, it's because I have seen that you can make change. And again, I'll go back to those early days of seeing in the civil rights movement people without any power, without any money, yet together and making some of the most profound and fundamental change for our whole country. And just knowing that you can have, knowing that what you do does make a difference really drives me. And I would say that the other piece of it for me is that at this point in my life, almost every day, I get an email or a call or something comes from someone that says, "You helped me in this way.
Hmm.
You saved my life. Now with the courses that I'm teaching, I hear, okay, I took this course and I would have never valued myself enough to apply for that next job, but now I know the value I bring, and so I got it." And those are the things, even the small things that feed my passion, that feed my up, and to know that we can make change in this world. We can do that.
I want to take a little bit of a different tack from Sam's question about your statement that you were foolish enough to apply and you never know where life is going to take you. Because later in your life, you wrote a book about women in power and women's relationship to power. And I think I have a relationship is now to power, and I think it's part of your optimism. But like, where was your relationship with power at that point in your life? Where you've graduated college, you've been part of the civil rights movement, you've worked for Head Start for 5 years. At this point, you have raised 3 kids, really. Um, so, like, what was your relationship with power like then?
I have to answer that question by going back to my teen years where I did not feel that I had power, that I had the ability to determine the course of my own life. I was very responsive instead of proactive. And I'm fortunate that my father always told me I could do anything my pretty little head desired. That was his language. And my mother, however, I witnessed in my mother a woman who felt she couldn't, in fact, do much of anything that she wanted to do, that she was always doing what someone else wanted her to do. And that was not her big rebellion in life was at 55 she became a CPA. And
Wow.
huge for her. I mean,
That's
that was
That
amazing.
is
huge.
huge.
That
Yeah.
huge. But because she was extremely brilliant, but she never felt she could, you know. So my female role model was not empowered, as it were, but I did have that little back of my head that kept coming back to me. So once I had started to college and started on, women who were involved in the community or involved in careers, I slowly began to realize that I guess I can determine the course of my fate as opposed to simply letting it happen. And it wasn't any one thing, it was a lengthy process. And I will tell you to this day, I still have my moments. I will self, I will myself using language that sounds like I'm a powerless little girl. And I'm like,
Mhm.
what's wrong with you? But these cultural things are hard to overcome. They're very hard to
Yeah.
overcome.
They're stubborn.
They're very stubborn. However, the other piece of that is that the more you use your courage muscles, the more powerful you will feel. And so taking risks, I love seeing people encouraging young girls today to play sports, to take all kinds of risks, because that's how you get a feeling of being powerful. And that's how you grow those courage muscles and willingness to take on things, even if you may not succeed.
So, what was it like for you to take over a national role at Planned Parenthood? Was it immediate that you felt like, okay, I've been here for years, I'm ready for this? Did it take a while to get used to that position?
There's a story I have to tell you about when it was happening that I was having to decide whether to even apply for that position. And so I ran the affiliate in West Texas for 4 years. At that point, I was ready to move to community, larger affiliate. I went to Phoenix. I was in Phoenix and ran the Arizona affiliate for 18 years. And at that point, I was getting kind of bored. I was ready to. I wanted to start writing books then. That was actually my goal at that. And I had set up my life so that I could take a year off and write a book. And at that time, there was an opening for the National Planned Parenthood position, and I was being heavily, heavily, heavily recruited. About that time, my husband and I went on a hike on the Milford Track in New Zealand. And I discovered the first day that I would have to face some fears that I didn't know I was going to have to face. I am terrified of suspension bridges. And it turned out that I would have to cross 22 really rickety. I mean, these weren't like nice metal,
Oh,
you know, this nice, big bridges here, but there's little rickety wooden planks with maybe one wire on the side that you could hold on to. Well, I mean, I freeze. I'm terrified. And I get the first bridge and I'm clutching my walk like, I can't even, like it will save me. And people are lining up behind me. Only one person at a time can cross this bridge. So I start across the bridge by telling myself three things. Number one, you have to keep your vision, your eye on the other side where you want to go, your intention. You have to take a deep breath and have the courage to believe you can get there. And then finally, excuse me, you have to take the action, because without the action, none of the rest of it really matters. You have to start putting one foot in front of the other, in front of the other, in front of the other, until you get to the other side. And while I was doing that, my life was passing my mind. And I was realizing that just before I had left, I had found out the candidate they wanted, and I was going to have to decide if I would take that job. And it was a time when there were some problems. It was not only that the political extremely tense, a lot like it is today, but that for me. Were getting murdered. I was getting personally stalked at home, getting neo-Nazi calls on my home phone. I had my personal, I was picketers, and I knew it was a dangerous thing to do. But more than that, I knew that I would have to bring the entire organization through a process of dealing with it emotionally.
Mm-hmm.
And time when the organization had several leadership changes, like 4 leadership changes in 5 years. So there were all kinds of problems. And this was all flashing in the time that I'm going across the bridge. By the time I got to the other side, I realized a few things. One is that didn't lose my fear even after crossing all 22 suspension bridges, but I learned that I could do it in spite of the fear. And the other thing I learned was sometimes you have to cross that bridge. Sometimes it's your moment. Sometimes you have to just not worry about the raging river below or the jagged rocks on the side. You're the right person to do something, and you know that you are, and they know that you are. You just have to stand up in the moment and take that opportunity. And it was an opportunity. It was a great opportunity for all of the travails. It was was a great opportunity to be able to practically reconstruct an organization. I took the whole organization through a 25-year out visioning process and whole sets of new programs, started growth again, got contraceptive coverage by insurance plans on the political front. And that was all great. Um, it was also exhausting and exhausting. So I wore myself out. Literally just wore myself out.
What you did to do Planned Parenthood is pretty remarkable. And I'm sure Sam has a couple too, but I do. You know, you brought, you said you really changed the organization. You brought what I think is really an entrepreneurial spirit to a very established nonprofit. Like, do those two things, can they work together?
Mm-hmm. I wouldn't have thought so, but they do. I wouldn't have thought so. And you probably heard the saying that Ginger did everything Fred did, but backwards and in high heels. And leading a nonprofit is a lot like that. You have to have all the business sense, but you do it where you're being scrutinized all the time. You do it where you don't have as much money or access to resources. And we did have to be very entrepreneurial because there were so many changes in the healthcare system. So ways that we were able to provide women's health care at fees or no fees for the women who couldn't afford it, we had to be very scrappy. We created, what you see now as the on every corner little doc in the box, I call them, the urgent care centers. I'm telling you, Planned Parenthood invented little neighborhood clinic that is very responsive to the needs of people, doesn't do every service, but you do what you do well, and you do it at a price people that can afford and with good customer service. And we sort of invented that. And also the use of nurse practitioners as clinicians and providers, and patients really like that better because nurses are trained much more in educational mode, to really talk to people. So that part of it was fun. And I guess my father was an entrepreneur, and I guess I had just ingested some of that in my daily life with my family. And to this day, I enjoy that aspect of what I do in a nonprofit.
You were also a pioneer of getting contraception covered by insurance. How did you make that happen?
It wasn't just me, for sure. There were people who had started seeing the injustice of it. And for example, there was a young woman in Seattle, a young pharmacist, who discovered that her pharmacy didn't cover her birth control pills. And so she sued them. And that was how I first got aware of what was going on. There's an injustice you don't see because it's invisible. Right? Women accustomed to paying for their pills, and we didn't even question it, right? Well, that wasn't the case. A couple of states where there had started being some grassroots movements to get insurance coverage. And so I quickly saw that this was one of the that almost everyone could coalesce around. That get some Republicans then, I don't know that we could now, we could get Republicans and Democrats to come together on something that would prevent the need for abortion, for one thing. And it made such economic sense. Being able to have children, when you're ready to have children, results in better outcomes. It results in, it enables women to enter the workforce. All of those things are great intellectual arguments. And so I saw that as being something that could bring a very fractured country together around an issue that, because 90%, 95% of Americans use birth control at some point in their lives, for goodness sakes. So almost everybody, contraception is a good thing. So that was one part, that big macro concept of how could really have a national dialogue about something that could bring people together on issues that had been very fractured and contentious. So that was one. But the other thing was, it was the injustice of women not getting this basic health care paid for. And we hadn't even being noisy about it. And so I started trying to get and we ended up, the first piece of federal legislation we got was in the federal employees insurance program. Is the largest insurance plan in the country. So that insurance plan, that most other plans started to follow suit. This legislation started bubbling up from the states as well, states. But here's the thing to know: couldn't get any media coverage of it at all. Couldn't big public discussion of it. Viagra gets invented. Viagra gets approved by the FDA, and suddenly every insurance is covering Viagra. Well, the next day I'm in America because suddenly it's become a big what? Insurance plans will cover Viagra? Really necessary. I mean, it's fine, it's good, but no. For women is a necessary healthcare provision. And that's when it became a big public issue and it got a lot more attention. We were able to make it more of a normalized thing.
Like as an aside, but when I started at my law firm in 2005, the female associates got birth control covered by our firm's insurance based on the argument that it covered Viagra. Like I mean, it's to your point. This was years later, but it was still like it was they did it.
Right. Yes. Yes.
Yep.
So, Gloria, over the course of the years, I imagine your relationship with money has changed enormously. How did it evolve from those teen years to today?
You're so right. So right. Yeah. My relationship with money has changed a great deal. When I was young, I discounted the importance of financial stability or just financial capability. I really, and probably that's because although we were I never had to worry about the next dime. And I think when you grow up in abject poverty, you learn very quickly how important money is. And so I didn't really pay that much attention to it. I hate to say this, but I never negotiated my salary until I became the national Planned Parenthood. And even then, negotiate it because it was had been making sounded like a lot. Mm-hmm. Then I came and I had to figure out how to pay for a New York apartment. So at that point, I went back and I did because it was clear that I had greatly undervalued myself. And slowly as time has gone on, and partly this is because of my study of women's relationship with power. In our culture, power and money are very much synonymous. So if our relationship with power is ambivalent, our relationship with money will be ambivalent as well. And I now can see that it was foolish of me that to me the best thing that ever happened was direct deposit into my bank account of my pay, because I didn't even want to think about it. I was doing the work I wanted to do. I didn't want to think about it otherwise. Well, that was not very smart. And I think that financial literacy for young women is just incredibly important, and understanding the importance of not just what's in your paycheck, but how you build your wealth, how you build your wealth for your future and the future of your family. And that was just not even something that for me until recent years. And now in the work that I do lead, we definitely talk about the relationship between money and power, and that that money and power are both like hammer. You can build something with it or you can break something apart. They have no characteristics of their own. So it's what you do If what you do with it is something good, well, then, you know, the financial capability. So that's my personal rethinking about money and power and deal with them and how you help women have a better relationship with money.
Another changes over time is our relationship with friends. And oftentimes when we're, younger, raising kids, it's hard to make time for friends. Who are your friends now and what do you do with them?
Oh my goodness. Well, one of the things that somebody told me when I Planned Parenthood was that your Rolodex is going to change quickly.
Hmm.
You know, the people who will answer your phone calls will change quickly. And that is definitely true. You find out who your friends are, who your real friends are, when you no
Yeah.
longer hold a particular position. But that my friends now tend to be fairly diverse, fairly much more diverse than they were in my life, and that's the thing. And they're I whenever I start noticing that all of my friends are my age, I start trying to make sure that I have friends who are in younger generations. A, so I know what's going on in the world, and B, friends.
Mhm.
So no, it's a real thing, you know. It really is something to think about. I I'm very blessed to have a few women friends who zooming at the beginning of the pandemic, and and it was just one of those, oh, why don't we do this on Sunday, and it became a regular week, and I've come to so appreciate that community of who care about each other. And sometimes
Mhm.
we talk about stuff that has very little, you know, that important particularly, but it's just knowing that you have a few other people in the world who are paying attention to what's happening with you and care about you, and we care about each other. And someone just had breast cancer, her soup and doing things for her, and it was somebody else just had a book published, and so we're all cheering her on for her, for the reviews, and those are the kinds of things that I've learned to value so much more as I've gotten older. It's very precious.
So you just touched upon aging. It's hard to believe you are 79 years old. Um, I first met you, I think it was over 20 years ago at Sally Menard's apartment for a political fundraiser, and Gail Furman, who was like my mentor, introduced us. Um, but I mean, you still look the same as you did then. I don't and you're not someone who's ever overly focused on looks or anything superficial. What is your relationship like with aging and beauty, and how has that changed?
I I can't believe I'm 80 years old either. Let me tell you, it's just like what? How does this ever happen? I just don't. I'm fortunate to have good health, but I'm fortunate to have good health, I think, because I do take care of my health. And
Mhm.
being in seriously being in very stressful jobs, I learned the importance of exercise, and also I will tell you, when I left Planned Parenthood, people started asking me if I'd had a facelift, and I realized it was because I was actually I was sleeping. Sleep is really
That's
good.
ridiculous.
Sleep makes you look a whole lot better.
Oh my god.
It's true. It's true. I mean, people would I say, "Well, no, I didn't have a facelift, but I'm getting sleep every night, which is I didn't for 9 years, especially as the national president. I I I ran on 4 or 5 hours of sleep every night. Not do that and stay healthy. So I do exercise is my really my secret sauce. And I never played sports as a child. That was way before Title IX. And when I was about 40, I started exercising, and I got a trainer who gave me a weightlifting routine that I use to this day. And
Wow.
I have to get some kind of cardio exercise almost every single day to stay feeling this good. And it makes me better. It makes me it releases those happy hormones, and I get really cranky when I don't get to exercise. So I would say exercise is my secret sauce, a little green tea, and not letting things get you down. You know, as you get older and you're dealing with many losses, and I think everybody has in these last couple of years, and I know, Amy, you've had all kinds of things that you've had to deal with that you would not have imagined, and you learn you can do these things and survive. Just learn that. And the more you learn that, you let other things roll off your back. They're just not as important anymore. Perspective.
Perspective it's life changing.
Yeah. Yeah, it is. It is. So that's a very nice compliment. And I am rather vain. I am rather vain. I told you.
Are you?
I told you that my father was an entrepreneur. He was in the clothing business, and so from a very early age, I loved clothing and fabrics. And the highlight of my life was driving from. We lived in Temple at the time, going to Dallas and getting to shop at Neiman Marcus with my mother. It's like the best thing ever. So I'm kind of a little bit of a fashionista, and I want to look good in my clothes. So I'm vain. I'm very vain. I'll own up to that.
So you have 15 grandchildren and 6 children. Is that number correct right now?
That number is
That's
correct,
still the
but I
number?
do need to say that 3 of them are my biological children, and 3 of them are my biological children, and then between 2 of us, we have those 15 grandchildren, of whom a few are great grandchildren. It's a big tribe.
For those that are girls and even the boys, how are they being raised differently even than you raised your children?
Hmm. I'm going to talk about the youngest girl. The youngest of the great grandchildren is 6 years old, and when I see her now, I will tell you that from her birth, she has been given all kinds of girly things, girly clothes, and they let her do makeup and stuff that I'm going at. But on the other hand, she is an athlete. She is her physical body, which I think this is a new generation of girls who know how to take up space. They know bodies. That is not something I knew, and I'm to see that, and I see that her family give her lots of opportunities to be in different kinds of sports, gymnastics, and things that she enjoys, and that give her that strength. I think.
Amy, do you want to do one last question before we go to the speed round?
Yeah. Gloria, what do the next 10 years of your career look like?
The next 10 years of my career look like this. First of all, I am planning this year to raise a lot of money to take the lead a sustainable. You see, the problem for me is I know how to do almost everything in an organization, since I started with a small one and grew it to a big one, and la 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 la, and I now, I can just do too many things, and I'm doing too many things. So I need to. So my plan here is to raise enough money to build a sustainable infrastructure, and be able to have a succession plan. I want someone else to run the organization. Believe it or not, even despite the fact I pretty much all of my career life, I don't really love organizations. I love the mission. I love I don't mind fundraising. I love doing the public facing work. I love the relationship, but daily operational stuff, no way. And
I think you have
so
kindred spirits on this call.
I'll hire somebody else to do that. And then as I am able to ease my a little bit, because I'll keep doing what I do, because Take the Lead is really based all on my own intellectual property. It's the courses I've developed and I've done, and I'm donating the use of all of that to Take the Lead, and I will continue to do that. But I want to be able to oversee that use of that, my books and my course kind of thing. But beyond that, I also have realized that I have had the opportunity to be both a maker and an observer of important elements of history. And so I haven't saved everything, but I want to organize my papers and put them into some kind of place where they will not just be on a shelf, but will be available working tools and documents for women's leadership for perpetuity. So I don't know what that's going to look like exactly. And I'm open to ideas from people for exactly how to do that. But I see that as being something that I definitely want to do in the next 5 to 10 years. So I feel a responsibility actually to do that because so much of history gets lost because we are all living our daily lives. And when you don't know, it's hard to create the future of your choice. We have these little, what we call our jewelry power tools at Take the Lead. And I'm wearing the history lantern that gives you insights into yourself. At hearts, we are all formed by the history that made us, and so it's important. And I want the next generation to know the history and be able to apply it to their own advancement and their own leadership. So that's what I see the next 10 years as being.
That's awesome. Well, Gloria, we are going to go to our speed round now. We're just going to ask you a few quick questions and you can give us quick answers. Amy, do you want to kick us off?
Yes. What book are you reading now?
Mm. I'm always reading a whole bunch of books all at the same time, and I probably have to look at my phone to tell you reading. But I'm reading. I'm reading. Let me see. What is the latest? Oh, gosh, this is the hardest thing to always. So I'm reading one called My Grandmother's Hands, and it's about racial trauma. It's an incredible, just an incredible book. I'm usually not reading things that are that deeply into psychology, but the author's voice is so gorgeous also. She's like just fabulous. It's wonderful, wonderful insights. I reading a book about that was set in Odessa, Texas, the first novel I've read in a long time, called Valentine. It's a hard book to read, but it's a hard scrabble life in West Texas. It's very true, and I got a lot of remembering some of the places as I was listening to it. So that was a good thing to do on as I was reading more. I usually read nonfiction.
You're an expert on leadership. Who, if you had to name 3 leadership experts you admire, who would they be?
I just did just one of my LinkedIn lives with this morning. Her name is Felicia Davis, and she's one of the leadership ambassadors for Take the Lead. She's has an organization called the Women's Collective, and she does branding for women. And the thing is, she can take my very straightforward ideas and turn them into really cool ways of teaching them. And I think teaching is something you are doing all the time when you're a leader. You have to be able to think in the story form and communicate in a way that people can hear you. So that's one. I, this is somebody who is not alive anymore, but Warren Bennis was one of the people from whom I learned the most. And what I learned was the principle that the first duty of a leader is the creation of meaning. Creation of meaning. And I'll tell you that really stood me in good stead. And our mentors also male. I have to understand there weren't that many female mentors for me when I was in, I almost find myself channeling him now. The things I learned from him were, and I go back to read his books all the time. His name is Watts Wacker, and yes, that's his real name. And he was a futurist, and it was like anything is possible. Anything is possible. Those are the things that have helped me do what I've done.
Sorry, I just am sticking with the anything is possible. Wondering, sometimes, sorry, we're in a speed round, but you just really wonder, like, is anything really possible? And really in the universe, like most things are, but it's hard to embrace it sometimes.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Um, what is your nighttime routine?
My nighttime routine is I I'm sorry to admit this. I usually do an extra couple of hours work. First of all, but then I lift weights with my husband. And that is kind of like our little routine before we go to bed. As he's not great on exercise, so I'm always trying to encourage him. And so we've started together. That's it.
How do you keep your romance alive?
Luck, I think laughing a lot. Laughing a lot. We talk about that a lot, that we do laugh a lot together. Um, I, we don't do any of the things that people always talk about. You don't see many candles and, like soft music, stuff like that around here. But, uh, but you know what? He's 91 and I'm 80, and we just are still all over each other all the time. What can
I
I
love
say?
that. That's amazing.
All right. So Lou Burns has been listening to our interview and he will
Oh,
be asking you the final question from the male perspective.
Hi, Gloria. First of all, I think it's amazing that you and your husband are like that. Gives me a lot of hope for my future and my wife, with my future wife. Thank you so much for being on our show. And I'm very intuitive. I'm a very intuitive, emotional human being. And I have a gift of attentiveness, and I have this feeling that you want to talk more about about your civil rights movement and your participation in it, because you didn't really get a chance to dive into it. And my dad actually was born in 1936, January 1st, 1936, and he would use, instead of talking saying black people, he would say colored, and he wouldn't say white
mm-hmm,
people, he'd say white folk, and because he grew
mm,
up in Augusta, Georgia, so he saw some
mm-hmm,
things. And one thing that he would say is the reason why black people, but he would say colored people, he said the reason why they have it so good is because white folk helped. So what was your role in the civil rights active in
mm.
that time period? Who did you work with? And also, did you get any flack from your neighbors and people that was around you? Because obviously you grew up in a time where segregation was still happening.
Right, right, indeed. All the things now, I was home with three small children of the movement of the '60s, and so while I've gone to Selma, my physically, I felt I couldn't do. I looked for things that were local, and mostly the things that I did were getting involved with groups like there was an organization at the time. I don't know if it still exists, called the something of Council of American Women or something like that. It was started by a religious group, women's religious group, but they brought together like a bunch of different women with different races and religions to do nothing more than, and yet this was big for that time, to form Panel of American Women. That was the name of it, Panel of American Women. And you could call upon to bring a panel to your group where there would be four people, each one representing a different religion. And that was the kind of thing that I was able to get myself involved with. It might not surprise you to know there wasn't a lot of marching or major civil rights activity at that time. And the black population of Odessa was like maybe 3% to begin with, but also it was more like, it just didn't happen. But able to do as time went on was to be supportive of the first black family that moved across the tracks, in my work at Head Start. It gave me the opportunity to bring my own children into groups where they were multiracial and multicultural, so that like I felt like I was teaching the next generation, everyone equally. And because with them, and you're digging in the garden with them, and you're doing all those things. So those were the kind. I would have. I didn't do anything terribly disruptive at the time, but I now realize that it small individual actions that you can each take, that when you add them together make big social change. So I don't know if that answers your question, but
Yeah, it does. Just a
that was how I.
a portion of it. What about the other part of it? Did you get any flack from your neighbors?
Oh,
Or
I'm trying to think about whether I did. I did. I got a lot of flack from my husband's friends, like sort of white males who were
yeah.
rather out things that I did. I would, so there was that kind of flack. Uh, nothing, nothing physical, nothing, and again, it was one of the ways that I grew my muscles to deal with the kinds of things I would later encounter at Planned Parenthood. I had much worse stuff that happened at Planned Parenthood, believe me. Yeah. Oh, the other thing, Lou, the other thing that made a big difference for me was that having started to college during those years, I did almost every one of my papers and all of my studies on race and civil rights movement and things like that. I mean, I just, in the politics of it all, I was just interested in it, fascinated by it, and am fascinated to this day. And in much like gender, these are social and I cannot figure out why people divide themselves the way they do. It makes no sense to me. And so I'm
Yeah.
just that as a social, uh, you know, a psychology. So if you can answer that question for me, I'd appreciate.
I wish I had the answer. I'm
With
still
your
trying to
intuition,
understand that right
with your
now.
intuition can help me with that. Would be
I
real
think it has
good.
something to do with their pride and ego, but that's just my
Oh,
thoughts on that.
maybe so. I don't know, but yes. So yeah, yeah, that kind of making me. All of you are making me think back a lot and um, remember things that I've probably not exactly remember. That question of whether I got flack is really because I had parents of my children who visited me at my home.
Mm-hmm.
Keep from anybody about that. Um, Things that were more like deliberately making social change, like like being supportive of the first family moving into our neighborhood, things like that. That
Wow.
I would get flack from most, and it was mostly from my husband's so-called friends.
Wow.
Gloria, thank you so much for joining us today. It's always a pleasure to talk with you, and we always learn so much from you. So thank you.
You are amazing.
Your podcast. Thank you. I love your podcast. They're wonderful. Your whole concept is so great. And both of you are so good at doing this and making people say things they might not have otherwise said.
Yes, they are.
I had no idea, Sam. I should have known just by doing math that Gloria was about to turn 80. And it got me thinking that, we've done a number of these interviews now, and we have interviewed many iconic women who are still doing so much work in their 70s and 80s. And it just makes me rethink everything I've ever thought about my own career. Like in this really inspiring, amazing, profound way. Like I aspire to be like Gloria Feldt and Gloria Steinem and
I was just
like
gonna say
why
the
not?
other Gloria. Yeah, Gloria
Yeah.
Steinem also, is in her 80s, and she is still not just like kicking, but she's making change in the world, and she's out there. And I really, when we meet these people, I don't think there's any difference between us and them. I mean, in terms of like the whole adage, like age is just a number, they embody it.
They really do, and they don't get discouraged, even though they're fighting some of the same bullshit fights they've been fighting for 50 years. They just keep going. And I love hearing about their friendships. It's so important. We always talk about this, Sam, like how important friendship is for women. And these are women who can still tell stories about going out and having fun with their girlfriends. Like life is long, and
Well,
there's so much to do. And
I think it's beyond friendship. Like, I just think they both have fun. Like, it's the whole thing that you and I always talk about, how like we're some of the few people we know who will just like hop on a plane at a moment's notice and say, yeah, I'll show up at that, and just make it work. And our tendency is to say yes over no. I think that if you look at the people we've interviewed, and there's such a wide variety, right, of everything from ethnicity to background, culture, to careers. And one of the things that kind of ties them all together is that optimism and that zest for just digging into life.
I also loved, like, one thing in Gloria's story that I loved is that she built this amazing career in a very non-linear way. And I also think that's something that we see among these really amazing, legendary women that we talk to who are in their 70s and 80s, is they have lived 1,000 lives. They have reinvented themselves 72 times. And I hold on to that right after what I've been through in the past couple of years, that you can reinvent yourself and you can live a new life and live to breathe another day. And it's just incredibly inspiring. Gloria is still plotting her next course. Like when we asked her, what does your career look like in 5 or 10 years? Like she had an answer. It was there. She knew. She's not done. Thanks for listening to What's Her Story with Sam and Amy.
We would appreciate it if you leave a review wherever you get your podcasts. And of course, connect with us on social media at What's Her Story Podcast.
What's Her Story with Sam and Amy is powered by my company, The Riveter, at theriveter.co, and Sam's company, Park Place Payments, at parkplacepayments.com.
Thanks to our producer, Stacey Para, and our male perspective, Lou Burns.